the questions if we have time as well. So we have a really exciting lineup today of panelists from Australia, Brazil, and Norway, and we're very much looking forward to hearing their perspectives. To start, I'll hand over to Enrique Garcilaso, who's the Deputy Head of Division and the Head of Regional and Rural Policy Unit at the OECD. And he's going to provide some context to the webinar and also the OECD work that we're currently doing on mining regions and on Indigenous communities. So I'll hand over to you, Enrique.
You are muted, Enrique. You are muted.
How about now? Can you listen?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Bridget, and welcome everybody to this event today. I think it's very exciting to be working on this topic because at the OECD we have two work streams that have existed for some years. We started to work more consistency on Indigenous topic with this report that we produced in 2018 called Linking Indigenous Communities with Regional Development. And we did that with 3 countries, that includes Canada, Australia, and Sweden. And throughout this process, it was a very rich engagement with a lot of Indigenous communities that we really wanted to get a sense, to listen to understand the aspirations of development from these communities, and from our side, how we can help develop new opportunities for development. So the focus was really around economic development and well-being. And at the same time, we've had a network on mining regions and cities that has existed since 2016. And gradually, more and more, we've been working with the topic of mining and how to improve communities and opportunities around well-being standards in communities that are within a mining context. So we worked a lot around the economic well-being, thinking about diversification of mining regions, but also on the social aspect around delivering better services, engaging better with communities, and of course the climate one is the one that we've also been working. And more we've started to work with Indigenous communities in a mining context, and I think these two work streams converged about last year when we did this conference in Karratha on mining, and we had a very interesting panel to discuss a bit better on how to improve opportunities for Indigenous communities that are living in a mining context. And what was really striking, having worked on these projects, is to observe the amount of wealth that is being generated by the mining sector, and the lack of opportunities that you have in contrast by some of the landowners on Indigenous communities. So I think there was an overall push to really rethink better on how to re-engage, or how to come up with different models of engagement between Indigenous communities and the private sector, especially when we look into the future, that we find that with the climate change and the demand for renewable energy, there's going to be a lot of demand for mining coming ahead. We're seeing many new projects at the OECD starting on critical minerals. And on the other hand, you have a lot of Indigenous communities that are landowners towards some of these mining firms. So I think what we try to do is to systematically come up with a number of actions and that can change this model that sort of sees Indigenous communities as a short term, as a bit of a engaging to sort of like on a subsistence and short-term measures towards really building their wealth. So that's I think that's, for us, it's what we would like to do. We have it in the next mining conference that is coming up in Canada, and we thought it would be interesting to hear from further voices, and that's why we're having today's dialogue. So I think we're here to listen to some of the speakers and the inputs on this very interesting topic for us. Back to you, Bridget.
Thanks, Enrique. So now we'll move on to the first panelist for the discussion. So we'll be looking at economic and governance and decision-making priorities to improve the Indigenous outcomes in mining regions, and also who is responsible for implementing these priority actions. So firstly, on this panel, we have the CEO of Yunjimbandi Nation, Michael Woodley. So please go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Bridget. You can all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
It's an interesting topic, obviously, and it's one that that existed in my part of the world for the better part of 50 years. I'm talking mining industries, mining, in particular iron ore, across 9 to 10 Pilbara First Nations groups. So these groups make up the landscape of a Rio Tinto operation, or a BHP operation, or even FMG operation, and a Roy Hill operations. Right? These are just the four majors that I've highlighted. Rio and BHP obviously are the two standout when it comes to mining activities. They've been doing it now for the last, like I said, just a little over 50 years, and it's one that obviously have in the beginning denied all existence of First Nations peoples. So we have a lot of catch up to do in terms of how we start the engagement first and foremost, and then how we lead down a path of self-determination, which then has a positive reflection on how you measure iron ore, or how you measure industry activities on our country with the well-being of First Nations peoples. I mean, you can only see that really and measure it really when you see the things that are not improving. So if you have if you kind of measure that up with the living standard of First Nations people, in particular with housing, health, education, life expectancy, and things like that, then you can see the trend normally going the opposite way versus how industry has in our region, and then beyond our region from a state-wide and then a nationwide, have contributed to many situations of people living a very comfortable and happy, healthy life, except for First Nations. So that's the history of mining on our country. The relationship started for us back in the early 1990s, 93 in particular, when a Native Title Act have come into law, and it's the first time that First Nations people in our country were given any legal rights to then speak for country, to speak for mining activities, and any other development on our country. And that obviously goes to the protection of heritage and the protection of environment. And where do we find that particular engagement point where we are not only engaging, but we are having the proactive discussions that takes into account First Nations people's concerns around those things. I mean, mining is something that we don't support because it's not part of the fabric of First Nations people, and how we obviously manage our natural resources. So that's the first point, I think. And then the second point is, where do you encourage industry leaders in thinking in that same, in that same path, and having that broader, thought pattern of it can't be on the mining can't be the answer to a independent sort of a wealth structure that is based on capitalism, that takes away First Nations people's interest on how we see mining in our country. So that's obviously been our challenge for the last 35 years, right? And I think the other important point to this is that changing the hearts and minds of industry leaders as well, in terms of getting them to think in that way of involving First Nations people. So that's kind of the backdrop of where we started our conversation of having a first-hand engagement with industry. That then leads to the recognition and respect that miners then have to, not say have to, I mean, would be in their best interest to have with First Nation people, because the Native Title Act give us that opportunity, and then out of that really determines how First Nation people would like to then further their self-determination path. For us, we've established what we call our 3C model, which is based on our community, culture, and commercial aspirations. But it takes in, I think, the value of all Ojibwe people in this valued system that looks at first and foremost the Ojibwe nation as a whole, our community, and how we can bring all those other factors to a really a one-sided affair, which is driven mainly on the basis of from a base of a capitalist system. So the 3C model is a nation building model, a valued model, a valued system that respects and recognizes all Ojibwe people, that they have a role and responsibility to contribute to our nation. And that's getting a lot of interest from industry, because they see, I think for the first time, that some groups have a self-determination path and a model to work from. Others seem to take a different approach. One of the biggest challenges that I have is individualizing our native title rights and interests. And I mean by once we've been recognized as First Nation people having connection to our country, individuals then under a capitalist system, which they're entitled to do, is to then set up their own businesses and continue operating on that framework, where I'm more of a nation building approach, where everything that we do is really for and on behalf of the nation, and we can then support obviously individuals to grow that way. But the native title rights that we have is really for all Ojibwe people, and I'm trying to encourage industry to recognize that first and foremost. If there is that structure and that desire where under our model, the 3C model is putting the nation first. Anything you want to add to that, Bridget, or you want me to keep going with?
No, I mean, you can keep going. It would be great as well to hear maybe a bit about how, I do know you're doing a lot of work with your Yindjibarndi Energy Corporation. So
Yep.
how you kind of apply these standards and the priorities of the 3Cs model to an actual project that you're doing. Maybe you could tell the audience as well a little bit of background about the project. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, what we do under each of those three portfolios is to make sure that first and foremost we have a voice that leads to a participation. In our community portfolio is more of, okay, what type of living standard that we would like to have, how the government are contributing to our health and education. In our cultural portfolio is more of what Ojibwe can contribute, in terms of protecting our language, protecting our cultural history, and making sure that industry and miners and developers are doing the right thing by first and foremost engaging with the organization that speaks for native title and native title interests around our country. Sorry, and the third one is our commercial portfolio, which gives us the opportunity to look at the wealth in our country, and how can Ojibwe be not only be a part of that, but also how we can contribute to our local economy as well. So under that structure is a few businesses that we set up. One of them is called Yura, and that's a more of a service type structure that employs people to work in industry in the industry sector. Sorry, either with ground maintenance or with a facility maintenance, civil construction, and building maintenance as well, is a pathway to employment, into mainstream employment, and that's now 11-year-old business. We started with only about 4 or 6 guys on the payroll, on the book, sorry, and then now we employ over 400 people. So that just gives you an idea, I think, of the growth of the region and the opportunities as well. If First Nation people want to really, capitalize on those opportunities. The next business that we have is our energy business, and we deliberately sort of went into this, part of the sector as well, because we've obviously concerned where climate change is taking us. We kind of see the changes in our own country with the environment, water, flora and fauna, and the Pilbara produces 42% of emissions in Western Australia. So if anyone got a bit of an idea of the state of Western Australia, it's a very large state, Perth being our capital city, but the Pilbara produces 52% of WA's emission. So to level that out, we need to establish 50 gigawatts of renewable energy within the next 50 years. But the other daunting part to that is that we also know through the Pilbara Development Commission that there is another 180 to $200 billion worth of new projects coming on stream in the next 10 years. So we kind of find ourselves, I think, collectively in this challenge to support climate change and reduce it as much as we can. But we need the Pilbara groups, which is compiled of 20 different language groups, just within the Pilbara. Give you an idea in terms of the land mass that we have under our native title is 13,000 square kilometers of land of Yijibani country, and our other neighboring group have a similar sized land, some slightly bigger, some slightly smaller, right? But what we do have is that we do have the land mass. We do have, I think, the interest from both government and industry that they also want to contribute to renewable energy projects. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity, I think, for the other 20 groups to get involved as well. Then we have Yijibani Water that, that oversees or wanting to oversee and manage the water take from our country. We have a natural aquifer called Millstream that is 80 k's away, or about 80 to 100 k's away from the towns of Karratha and that Pilbara region where the mass of the industrial activity occurs with mining iron ore and also gas. And that's been operating now for the last 50 years, and we've been obviously concerned about that as well. And that produces or takes out of the country anywhere from 6 to 11 gigaliters, depending on the other resources and the strain of those other resources. So that's been a massive concern to us. So our deliberate approach to that, in terms of working with government industry to make sure that we keep all the water in our country and we manage it in a way that it protects our environment, our landscape, and continue to sort of fulfill the obligations of everybody's responsibility to also keep and manage water on country. And we've also joint venture with other small sort of projects as well. But that model enable us to set up strong businesses, successful businesses that could then generate funds that goes back into our trust, and the trust then supports both the community and cultural portfolios. So it's the circular economy within the Yijibani nation, and it's the rising tide lifts all ship mentality. Well, like I stated earlier, it's a valued system that values all Yijibani people, and to remind them as well that they all have an obligation to contribute back to the nation.
That's great. Thank you, Michael.
But a bit mindful of time as well.
No, that's good. Was there anything else you wanted to add? Or if others have questions, they can put them in the chat or raise their hand, and we can allow you the function to speak as well for the audience. But if there was anything else you wanted to add, please feel free. Otherwise, we will move on to Darren next. But
well, just quickly, I think one of the things I want to also encourage as well, I think, as I'm talking, as a First Nations group, and I want to this opportunity is to also get to the wider population of First Nation groups as well. I think relationship is the most important part of our journey, and that's a relationship building that we have with both government and industry. One of the things that we do suffer from, I think, as First Nation people, is that we seem to live more in the past than sort of recognizing what the future holds. And that's something I want to encourage all First Nation people to look at what's in front of us. We obviously, need to be reminded of what happened in the past, but I think, times have changed. And what we do have as well today is a lot of good people, regardless of the background and their race, but they all many of I work with, or many of them work for me, are really good people, and they want to do the right thing, and they're looking for the right opportunities to also contribute back to First Nations self-determination, growth, and our contribution to our local economy. So that's it.
Okay, perfect. I think that's a great message to end on. And thank you, as always, for your incredible insights. I think a lot of us on the call were really happy to hear from you today. So now we do have some questions, but we can address those at the end of this panel. But we can move on to Darren Godwell, who is the CEO of I2I Global in Australia, to hear his perspectives now on the key considerations and the actors to improve governance and decision making as well. So please go ahead, Darren.
Thank you, Bridget. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded territories and lands of the Yuggera and the Turrbal people over here in Australia. I'm actually on the opposite side of the continent to Michael and his country. And I'm in the city of Brisbane, or its traditional name of Meanjin. I'd also like to acknowledge other Indigenous peoples that are on the seminar online with us tonight, and extend my respects to you. And I'd like to make a special mention and pay my respects to you, Michael, for the work and the efforts that you've put in to protect your country and to uphold your ancestors and your law, and offer, doing that often in the face of a very serious opposition. And I'd like to pay my respects to you. You're an inspiration, my friend. I'm going to share a couple of elements on a slide. I'll make the slides available because I'm not going to go through all of the slides. So I'll make them available, Bridget. And if anybody's interested or they wanted to see the full slide deck, then by all means, you're free to share them. And part of what I was hoping to go through is just to explore a little bit some of the practical elements of what we've been looking at. So I2I is an Indigenous company. We've been working with traditional owners and Indigenous interests across the last 7 years. We have a focus on economic development and enterprise and business development, but in ways that are consistent with the ambitions of local traditional owners or tribes or First Nations. And that isn't always straightforward work. And so part of what we've started to address and to try and be part of a constructive conversation about is around increased economic development on country. Very large scale projects such as mining and renewables, large infrastructure, and in some instances also defence related projects and capabilities happening on country seem to be increasingly occurring on Indigenous lands. And we were challenging ourselves to come up with the appropriate architecture that would enable Indigenous interest to prevail in the face of these very large projects. And so to do that, we started looking at ways for Indigenous inclusion. And where we got to very quickly is because of our experience in investment and finance, we got to understand that project finance for these large projects is the grease that turns the wheels. And at those critical points in the development of those projects, the proponents would go to the capital markets to raise investment capital from total strangers, and on that journey, they would walk past the traditional owners on whose country the project was happening, and they would exclude or omit those Indigenous interests. And so this is something that we were really focused on, because until that dynamic changes, then Indigenous and peoples would continue to be excluded from those economic development opportunities on country. Obviously, Australia is just one location in the world, and there was emerging standards and practice which we were seeing and observing with First Nations interest in America and in Canada, and then with Maori brothers and sisters in Aotearoa. So we wanted to draw on those examples of best practice globally. We wanted to look at how do we address the hurdles that go into project finance. And this is where the capital markets and their work around assessing risk and assessing the viability of proposals and projects is something that's very important. And yet Indigenous peoples to a large degree have not been interacting with those capital markets. And so this for us is an opportunity for some growth as well. And then we went looking for those opportunities, those commercial opportunities and commercial outcomes for Indigenous interests on their own country. And where we could see Indigenous interests being involved early in project design and feasibility, we also saw opportunity for Indigenous peoples to be contractors and service providers to those projects. Historically, Indigenous interests in Australia have been offered royalties, but royalties come many years downstream, and royalties are very precarious because they're dependent upon, in many cases, the operating mine or the operating company generating a profit, and then a proportion of the profit is set aside for Indigenous interests. And so that very long delay on seeing any material benefit being derived to Indigenous interests for a project that could be 5, 7, 9 years in development, and then maybe 3, 5, 7 more years in operations before royalties arrived, was also a material concern to us. So these were the elements that we were looking at, and where we've arrived at, and I'm not going to read this slide, but where we've arrived at is a model which would allow traditional owners to join with capital markets to participate in capital raises for projects on country. And for those that have worked in investment and finance, this is very much the work of mainstream investment banks. And they very much look to raise the capital. They do look to stack the capital requirements. They look to build deals. They look to bring in debt finance as well as equity investors. And then they shape the deck, the capital deck. And so what we believe is emergent now is there is a greater appetite from traditional owners and tribes and First Nations to participate in those capital raises and to work with capital markets around addressing elements of risk and upholding Indigenous rights. Again, I'm not going to read through all of this at all, but I am going to flag that in our work with investment banks around some of these, we see some over the years, we've seen some common elements present themselves. So we're looking at, are there shared objectives of co-ownership and equity between Indigenous peoples, tribal peoples, and the project proponent? Where is the capacity for negotiations? Have sufficient experts and time been provided to Indigenous stakeholders? Who's quantifying and costing the financial risks, and then how are they apportioned between the different participants in a project? So who is sharing those risks, and where are they being carried? And then obviously we start looking about what is the power and the dynamic of being an investor as opposed to being a supplicant. We look at appropriate mechanisms of governance and oversight, and then we move into some of the other practical things such as legacy issues. Many mining projects actually, for however many years they are in operation, they very well may have as many years in rehabilitation and remediation post-closure. And so for our people, Aboriginal people and Indigenous peoples in Australia, we are coming to grips with the legacy issue of previous mines and operations. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this slide, but we've done quite a bit of work to look at those examples from different jurisdictions. And, we see quite a lot of the mining company activities being repeated from different jurisdiction to different jurisdictions. So global miners take a playbook with them And when they are operating in South America, when they're operating in Canada, when they're operating in Australia or Indonesia, they look to standardize a lot of their practices and engagements. And we just think there's some merit in Indigenous interests becoming aware of what the standard playbooks look like, and then obviously to be able to formulate our own responses as Indigenous peoples to protect Indigenous interests. So one of the items that were put to us as panelists was to offer an illustration or an example. And so for eye to eye, the example I'm going to use here has been de-identified as best we can, because it's not necessarily appropriate to divulge those particulars at such a place. But the case study was that we were brought in by a large mining company to work with them around the challenges they had of operationalizing the international standard around Indigenous rights of free, prior, informed consent. And so at a policy level, the company had adopted this standard. In the operationalizing, it was still some ways to go. And so we were brought in to work with them and then to prepare the process as it moved forward with those traditional owners. And for I2I Global, we're working very much at identifying the risks to the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights, and then in the same way to identify the risks to the mining company in its ongoing operations. And it's that risk approach which helps us then to quantify the risks to the capital markets or investors, because each of these mining companies on each of these large projects, they go to the capital markets to raise capital. If they can't speak to those risks and controls, then that has an impact on the cost of capital to these mining companies. So for us, there's very much a case to be made, a positive case, which says that when you have traditional owners or tribal nations or First Nations involved, from as very early in the process, including design and co-design, and at that point of capital raise or capital allocation, you shape those projects and the certainty of those projects in very positive ways that reduce the risk to Indigenous interests and reduce the interest to the company. So, and we've been involved and documented that. This will be the last point I'll just put up here, but I just want to point out that in different jurisdictions, we do have statutory rights and we have treaty rights. However, the emergent standard, which is now maybe not so emergent, which is around consent and the consent of Indigenous peoples, that FPIC standard has now been adopted in a very constructive way by the capital markets as a way to screen for Indigenous rights. And are the proponents of the development, are they actually proceeding in a way that upholds those Indigenous rights? And in the past, we may have felt that a statutory right or a statutory regime of a state would be sufficient to protect those Indigenous rights. But as with many other considerations within our globalized economies now, the opinions of stakeholders such as the capital markets is now as powerful and influential as the statutory rights that may be conferred in a state. And it's the presence and the active engagement of those stakeholders in the capital markets, which I believe create a source of influence and a positive source of influence over the conduct and the behavior in mining. And so it's that new point of influence, which I think has created an opportunity for Indigenous interests. And I think Indigenous interests who wish to participate with the capital markets in assessing projects and developers and proponents and what project they're putting forward actually becomes a constructive engagement, which allows the capital markets to ascertain risk in a more accurate way, and in ascertaining risk to also price risk. And that's something which I think is really powerful and worth exploring. So that's where I'll stop there, Bridget. So
That's great. Thank you, Darren. That's, yeah, very informative presentation. There's a few questions in the chat. We have a little bit of time, so I might direct them to you if that's okay. Something interesting is talking about in the chat whether enough has been done to reimagine our economic and industrial model. You spoke a little bit about capital markets and how this is influencing mining and creating some opportunities as well for Indigenous peoples. So in that context, is enough being done, though, to kind of reimagine how Indigenous communities can make the most of these opportunities as well?
our starting point is a rights-based approach. So the recognition of Indigenous rights and the upholding and the protection of those Indigenous rights. And one of those rights is the right of Indigenous peoples to not give their consent to participate or to see a project proceed on their countries in ways that diminishes or undermines their interests. So we start from a rights-based approach, and we believe that many projects are actually they are of such a low impact that with Indigenous participation, because the project is proposed for their country, those impacts can either be ameliorated or reduced entirely through controls, which might mean Indigenous co-design, might mean Indigenous oversight and monitoring. It might mean Indigenous contracting in to manage impacts in ways that are appropriate. So if we think about what's happened through the last 200 to 300 years, then the resources industry has exploited those resources on our countries to our exclusion. And often negative impacts have been unfairly transferred to Indigenous interests for their own country and tribal interests. And so when I talk about negative impacts, I'm talking about lasting and ongoing environmental damage, and where our peoples may have a responsibility for the safety and the sustainability on managing our environments and our lands and waters. If we were not involved in the design of that project, then we're excluded from being able to exercise our cultural rights around protection of our natural lands and waters. But going forward, I believe that with Indigenous interests involved, many projects would continue, but they would be improved as projects. And for a number of projects which would not receive consent, I still think there's greater opportunity for Indigenous interests for those projects that do proceed. And so, and the decision is absolutely rests with those traditional owners and tribal interests on their countries to determine where and how or if that should happen.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And who would you say, you know, given this context of exploitation and the impacts that historically mining has had on Indigenous communities, in bridging this gap of engagement, who would you say is the responsible actors to kind of initiate that process?
Well, so large mining interests, tier 1 and tier 2 mining interests, continue to use other people's money to progress their projects. So they go to the capital markets to raise money from investors to progress their projects. Very rarely are they entirely self-funded. In fact, it hardly happens at all. The first point of responsibility rests with the capital markets in making those investment decisions. Are they investing into a company that is going to behave irresponsibly? And are they undermining or upholding Indigenous rights for that project? And the capital markets are taking that responsibility very seriously. And in different jurisdictions, they are exercising their fiduciary responsibilities around making responsible investment decisions. And so I think the point of who's responsible is it's with the capital markets when allocating capital, whether that's equity or whether that's debt, to ascertain the extent to which the proponent is upholding or undermining Indigenous rights. So that's for me the first place. If the capital markets are not confident that that proponent and that company is upholding those Indigenous rights, it should withhold funding. It should not proceed. And if they don't proceed, then that mining company or the proponent would then be forced to go to secondary and tertiary funding markets to raise the capital if they want to proceed on that basis, on an unmodified basis. And then when they move into secondary and tertiary capital markets for investment capital, the price of that capital will increase substantially. And then those projects become uneconomic. And that, I think, is probably the most powerful lever that we can look to exercise with the capital markets.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Darren, and thank you for your presentation as well. In a very timely manner, we have a question from Michelle about environmental practices, which is perfect because our next session is on the social and environmental dimensions, and particularly looking at these activities, how they can be culturally appropriate for Indigenous peoples in mining regions. So we're going to move on to Edson Krenak from Cultural Survival, who's going to provide some of his perspectives. So please go ahead, Edson.
Thank you, Bridget. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Darren, for your inspiring words, and also Michael for his participation. And I greet my relatives here present and also in the audience. And thank you all for being here. I am Edson Krenak, as Bridget already presented, and I also would like to express my gratitude for the invitation. And I will be sharing from a little bit different perspectives. Brazil. I am from a region that is called Minas Gerais state. Minas Gerais stands for General Mining, is a colonial name since 18th century. This entire state that is larger than a French territory, the country France, and it's a really huge state. It has been the main provider of metals and minerals for the world, since like diamonds, gold, aluminium, now lithium, and many others, graphite, etc. Iron, especially for the whole century, 20th century. But unfortunately, this region is also one of the poorest regions in terms of access to education, health care systems, and universities, justice, etc. And we have in Brazil a strong legislation framework to protect Indigenous people. Since 1988 Constitution, we have our rights to land, to our territories, recognize our existence, recognize our rights to have our demarcation, our cultural practices protected by the law. Unfortunately, in the practical terms, is not what is happening. Unfortunately, we have most of the mining companies are international enterprise. Even Brazilian companies like Vale, they are present in many countries. Even in Canada, it's a Brazilian company, but Brazilian is an international organization, a company, but they are present in Brazil, historically in my region, and also in Canada, in many countries. But how these companies operate makes the scenario very different, because they discriminate. It looks like the same company have different policies in different parts of the world. That's why we have our priorities overlooked, because of a discriminatory regional development projects proposal or even a violation of rights. I wanted to share with you the 4 priorities of indigenous peoples from a very specific region. I'm not representing the entire country. We have more than 300 indigenous peoples in Brazil. We have more than 200 different languages speaking. We have 7 biomas, and Amazon forest is the most well-known bioma. I'm not speaking on behalf of them, but I would like to ask permission to my ancestors, to my relatives from this specific region to share their priorities. I have been working for years with them, and then we have been discussing these things. The 4 priorities. The first one is about governance and resource management. This region, I'm talking about Vale do Jequitinhonha Valley, is now some companies and even government wanted to rename it as a lithium valley, is the home of 8 indigenous communities, 10 Quilombola communities. Quilombola is a maroon African traditional community that is since the 17th, 18th century, they live in the region. They escaped from slavery. They formed traditional communities with support of indigenous peoples in the region. I'm talking about 300, 400 years practice of partnership between indigenous peoples and Quilombola peoples in this region. And in this area, there is also home of dozens of traditional communities. They are traditional in many practices, music, artwork, handmade material, clothing, and food systems and medicine systems. The center of these traditions, what I would like to share, this is not of course I'm not criticize the panel. I compliment the invitation. The topic is very important, but the lack of women in our panel. We have Bridget here, but I mean indigenous women from our region. I hope the next years we have more women participate in these spaces, because in this region, women represent 70% of the leadership. I'm talking about traditional governance led by women and youth participating. I know it's not always easy to bring them out of their regions because they are taking care of the house. They are taking care of the territory. They are taking care of the governance. And unfortunately, the limit, the problem, we used to say the stone they find on the road that impede them to advance, to go further, to develop their governance and to protect the territory is the fact that colonial patterns of resources extraction has been very present, ignoring their leadership, ignoring the presence there. We have in Brazil add to the free, prior, informed consent one term that's called good faith, because some companies, they conduct the consultations, but they consider the consultations already consent. They consider like 2-3 years of engagement with indigenous peoples already, okay, we are working with them, like what is happening there. We are working with them. There is a sharing governance, but we don't know about consent. They don't wait for the consent. They don't wait until we have the collective decision of these communities to come and say, yes, you can conduct the instruction. Yes, with condition, you can conduct the instruction, but we have to put some limits. We have to discuss some landscapes, some areas that should be protected. Or no, we cannot permit those distractions here. And this governance has been undermined by not we'd say, not a proper FPIC consultation or protocols. That's why we have been developing in Brazil, many indigenous peoples, a protocol, a local protocol of FPIC. You go there, okay, we wanted to start a FPIC conversations with you, consultation, and then each community prepare their own protocols to conduct those consultations. And to conclude this first priority, I will make the next one a little bit briefer, because I would like to hear questions and also comments. To make those protocols better, they prepare these very local, adapted ways of consultation, because the FPIC doesn't belong to the state, doesn't belong to the company. The FPIC is a consultation that belongs to the communities that have to set their own terms. It's like I'm visiting your home, your house, I knock the door, I enter your house, I cannot decide where I'm going to sit, what I'm going to eat, where I'm going to sleep, how I'm going to use your own house, right? But unfortunately, people are not even knocking our doors. They are opening our door, they are entering, then taking our furniture, they're taking our food, they're taking everything, and we are left without even house. This is what's going on there. The second priority of this, the first one is to integrate indigenous peoples in their own governance management. The second is integrate their traditional indigenous knowledges in environmental stewardship. I will give one example. In this region, the Aranan people have kind of a root. I'm not kidding. Is a root? It looks like a cassava, manioc, potato, but each root can get to 61 meter size, and with thousands, some of them 100 of kilos, very huge. They can provide food for several families. These roots, for them, it's important to keep that root, to keep the size and the quantity available in the territory in a wild space. You cannot monoculturize this root, because according to them, is a gift spontaneously given by nature. You cannot remove the traditional territory of these roots to another area for the sake of extraction. This traditional knowledge for centuries have been protected by these communities, but unfortunately, this root, when the country, Brazil, discovered that, we have the first researches in the last 2 years, just in the last 2 years, the first university research started, discovered this root. This root is already on threat of extinction because of extraction in this area. Not integrating indigenous knowledges to these projects, respect this knowledge, can undermine not only their rights, but also the healthy environment. The third point is the priority of these indigenous people has to do with that, is the definition of economic growth and empowerment. We cannot receive from state or from companies what means to be economically developed. There is no, for us, there is no economic development without strengthening our livelihoods, our language, our tradition, and protecting our sacred place. And economic empowerment means benefit sharing that keeps the environment healthy, keep the place where they live protected. We are open to mining in this region. We are open to new energy projects. We are open to that, but we cannot let the historical enterprises there without any plan of benefit sharing, how we can protect our livelihoods. Because what is going on there right now? Kids that used to go to school like they walk 2-3 hours safely. This is their tradition, their way to go to school, walking 2-3 hours through the territory safely, to go to school, to go to visit another territory, etc. But they no longer can do that. They can no longer enjoy the environment because the economic investment in the region didn't consider that and impact the environment. They are being attacked by animals, by bats, epidemic. They are afraid of explosions because it's too close to their territories. And the roads built by some companies without the due consultation process to these communities is disturbing with dust in the air, contaminating their air. It's that they cannot safely go. The community has to buy a car, a vehicle to bring their kids to school. Imagine that. This is not what the community wanted. The company thought they wanted that. But this is not development for us. Development for us is to keep our ties to the environment, to keep our traditional ways, to integrate our everyday life to where we live, to our territory. And the fourth priority of these communities is I am talking about a region that have been coexisting with mining for almost 200 years. And the big question is, why is the region, I'm not now no longer talking only about indigenous peoples, has the lowest access to education, healthcare system, as I mentioned at the beginning, and other developments? Why? Then we need a shift. We need a transition here. And for us, a just transition cannot happen without a proper access to justice. We need this access to justice. And justice for us is not only in the future, like Darren was sharing. We cannot wait 8, 10, 12 years to come some benefits. First, we have to deal with the historical legacy of those minings, compensation for impacted already areas. We have projects for agricultural restoration areas. We have a project for gardens. We have projects to restore rivers. We, in our traditional ways, we can, I will use a sentence to make our audience understand. We have projects to resuscitate rivers, to restore rivers. We have traditional ways to sum up the waters again, because this area is very dry in Brazil, face like not only the regional seasonal weather condition because of the biome, but also is facing increasingly impact of climate change. But we are being unable to apply our traditional knowledge to restore the environment because the partnership with the state, with the companies, are very, very weak when is existent. We have to think about that, to how to access to justice, but not injustice in the court, not injustice to okay, your future is guaranteed here. For indigenous people, the future is now, is present, is to be able to live in our traditional way right now. We wanted to protect our sacred areas. Our territories is full of life, full of relatives, where we perform our spiritual practices, our traditional medicine, our celebrations. We wanted to be able to keep doing this in a healthy way, but to access to this just transition, we have to repair what was damaged. And unfortunately, the same companies, I could showcase that, but I don't think it is a space for that. The same 2-3 companies that have a proper, and I would say even very good mitigation and compensation policies in Canada, in US, in Sweden, they don't have anything even close to that in Brazil. Then we need international organizations, we need these discussions to call upon these companies to have a consistent and coherent practice in a global scale, not take advantage of local, regional, juridical or legal landscape, because the international laws that protect indigenous peoples are international. And just transition is for all. We are talking about no one behind. We are talking about global environmental sustainability goals. We are talking about these big goals, global commitments. We are talking about international standards for mining industry. But unfortunately, we are seeing a very a lack or a slow process of applying this on the ground. And the solution is very simple, as my colleagues already highlighted: invite indigenous peoples to participate. Because one aspect of FPIC that we are ready to apply is participation. It's not only consultation. We wanted to participate. How to manage our territories, how to guarantee benefits for all, not only for indigenous peoples. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Edson, for those insights. A lot of amazing information there. And I have many questions. I'm sure others do as well. In the interest of time, though, I might save those till the end of the webinar, just so that we can let Eric present, because I know that he has to leave on time. So yeah, I'll hand over to Eric Larson now, who is with the Sami Human Rights Council. So please, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and allow me first to acknowledge other indigenous peoples present here, and also the organizers and the audience. So my name is Lasse Ivar Erke, Erik Larsen in my passport. I'm the head of the Human Rights Unit in the Sami Council, which is a Sami NGO covering Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia, the Sami areas in those countries. So I have a presentation here, which I will share. It's only a map, so you can see where the Sami traditional land is. So I also wanted to comment on Brother Edson's timely comment on women and youth, and I'm proud to inform you that most of the Sami leaders are females, and many of them are youths. So usually there are Sami females and youths who represent us in different meetings. So we are very happy and proud of that. And it's an old tradition we have. So the first national Sami gathering was actually organized by a female over 100 years ago, so this is part of our proud history with female leaders. So Sápmi, as you see in my presentation, is the Sami people's own name for our homelands. So we are in the northern part of the Scandinavian peninsula, and a large part of the Kola Peninsula in Russia. And traditionally we have livelihoods such as reindeer herding, fishing, hunting, gathering, agriculture, and handicrafts. So they are essential to Sami culture. So our people is not that large. We don't have exact numbers, but we estimate around 50 to 100,000, 20,000 in Sweden, around 50,000 in Norway, 8,000 in Finland, and just 2,000 of us live in Russia. Politically, we have 3 Sami parliaments, one in Sweden, one in Finland, and one in Russia, which are representative institutions. of the Sami people living within that country. We do not have a parliament in the Russian side, but we have non-governmental organizations on the Russian side. And all the parliaments were established in the 90s or in the end of the 80s. And the Sami Council, where I'm working, it's an older organization established in 1956. It's an umbrella NGO for Sami national organizations, and we have member organizations in all 4 countries. So just to put the context for our situation is that Sweden, Norway, and Finland has all voted in favor of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Russian Federation voted in favor of the outcome document of the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples in 2014. And they consider it as an acknowledgement of the declaration. So all of our countries have acknowledged the declaration. In addition to that, the Norwegian state has ratified the ILO Convention on Indigenous Peoples, number 169, as the first country to ratify that convention. And in the constitutions of Sweden, Norway, and Finland, they have acknowledged the Sami people as an indigenous people of their country. So allow me first to say a few words about terminology regarding activities and development projects on the lands and waters of indigenous people. So often we hear that we are referred to as communities, and that's true. We have communities, but first and foremost, we are indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples communities, if we are speaking about a specific community within our people. And why I'm stressed this is because all peoples have the right to self-determination, which is key, speaking about land issues. And we often also hear that we are stakeholders, but actually indigenous people, they are right holders of their own land. The stakeholders are actually the developers, investors, and even state governments are stakeholders in our perspective. So this is our basis when we are speaking about development projects on our land. Because as all other indigenous peoples, we are specialists in sustainable use of the nature and environment where on our land. And we have a deep connection and dependence on the nature. We live our lives in respect and harmony, and in a truly sustainable way. And we have learned that nature is willing to give if the human only takes what is necessary. So we have a word for this, birgen. We shall not overuse or overharvest. And we have learned from our childhood, if we do, then the spirit of nature will strike back and harm us. And we have a Sami name for a creature, a fish. Maddo is the name of this fish. And if we, for example, overfish, then Maddo will come and punish us. So this is a deep connection and respect for our land and resources. So the backdrop of I guess the seminar and all the discussions going on regarding indigenous land is rooted in climate change and the need for a green transition. And we have a significant negative effects due to climate change in the Arctic already. So Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the world, and we actually 3 times faster than other world regions, and we experience higher temperatures, permafrost thaw, changes in snow cover, loss of sea ice, more extreme weather events, and we see that globally, declining biodiversity and new species coming to our land and waters. So all this is threatening our lives. So we have an interest in the green transition as well. But simultaneously, there is an increased global interest to nature development, resource development in Sami and other indigenous lands, such as mining, renewable energy projects, and so on. And these are often in direct conflict with the Sami livelihoods and indigenous livelihoods. So as a result of this, many indigenous peoples, as for example the Sami, we are not only highly affected by climate change, but also by land encroachment justified by the green transition. And that's why we, in our perspective, often refer this as green colonialism. It's actually a double burden, which is a paradox. On the one hand, the Sami and many of indigenous peoples are among the most affected by climate change, but not the most responsible for the climate change. But on the other hand, indigenous peoples are expected to carry the burden of mitigation and allow land encroachment in our remaining land. So this is a paradox and a challenge for us to overcome. So following this, many governments, the Nordic as well, they have permitted significant increase of industrial projects on our land, and numerous major projects are either ongoing or in the planning. And this is of course of a deep concern to us. So let me underscore that Sami lands already produce more green energy than we need. Many rivers are already taken from us. Mountains are taken from us in order to produce electricity and export electricity, because our land is also already producing more renewable energy than we actually need. Some days of the year we are actually getting paid to use electricity because the companies need to get rid of the electricity. And we have also contributed with the minerals numerous times of our share. So this is a challenge to us. So and there are also other land encroachments and development projects. So I'm sorry that this picture is kind of blurry, but it shows the result as with the many different activities and land encroachment and the cumulative impacts they may cause. So one project might be okay for our existence and our livelihoods, but when everything is happening at the same time, there are major challenges, and this is some of the shortcomings in the Nordic regulations. The different type of authorities does not speak with the other authorities. The one responsible with energy is not speaking with the authority responsible for mining, and so on. And that's why it's really massive at the moment, with all this outside interest for our land in order to make the green transition. And we also know that the EU have adopted acts that is going to increase the number of projects and also make fast track processes on this. And this also create a lot of challenges regarding our capacity to defend and to voice our interest with all these projects. So the social cultural aspects of development projects in our area of the world might be different from other areas, because the Sami people are already living in welfare states. We pay our taxes, contribute to the state economy with our livelihoods. In return, we have free healthcare, free kindergarten, free schools, free education. We have renewable energy, as I said. Um, so when we are speaking about new land encroachment, it doesn't necessarily means development for our culture, because our culture is depending on land. Our language is depending on land and our traditional livelihoods. Our languages, our culture will not survive if every Sami is working with mining. So what for us to gain with new development projects when we already have free schools and everything we need? So that is our context. So this brings me to my last point, and that is how we can offer stakeholders as states and mining companies a process where we can discuss potential solutions. So we firmly believe that the free, prior, and informed consent must be implemented. It's not only a right for Indigenous peoples, but it's also the tool that we offer states and mining companies when considering development projects on our lands and waters. So the free, prior, and informed consent will ensure security, predictability, and possible benefit sharing for Indigenous peoples in such processes. It will give us the necessary security we need in order to even dare to go into the meeting room to discuss projects, because then we will know that we have a security. But this is also the tool we offer. So it's important that even when states fail to uphold the free, prior, and informed consent in their permission processes and all the decisions that needs to be done. If the state fails to uphold FPIC, the mining companies should respect FPIC, because we need both to respect our our right to a free, prior, and informed consent. So I believe that this is key. I will provide one example, and it's from the Norwegian side of our land. The Mineral Act of Norway, the Mining Act, was adopted in 2008 or 9. I can't recall at the moment, but 2008 and 2009. And the Sami Parliament in Norway did not accept this act and did not accept any of the activities regulated by this act. And since then, there has not been developed a single new mining project in Norway on Sami land, because we are not agreeing on this in the act. The framework does not give us the necessary security, and that means that it actually seems to be hard to develop such projects. So that's why I'm stressing the free, prior, and informed consent. This might be your tool to success when you have interest in Indigenous people's land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for your presentation. Again, very interesting perspectives, and thank you for your time. I know you had to take some time out of your MP duties, so thank you so much for that. I know you might have to leave, but we have one question for all the participants, and Eric, you might want to go first. We've spoken a lot today about free, prior, and informed consent. So we're wondering if you could give your perspective on what regional and national governments can do to help support FPIC or help others to implement it effectively.
Yeah, thank you. If I could go first, the situation in our part or in our region is that none of the states has implemented the right to free, prior, and informed consent. But we see that judicial decisions is referring to the right to the free, prior, and informed consent, and actually have made some verdicts that has stated a violation on the human rights of indigenous peoples on the lack of the free, prior, and informed consent. And I also know that the Inter-American Court, International Court, also has made decision with reference to the free, prior, and informed consent. So first, there need to be a political will to implement the free, prior, and informed consent. And we, from the indigenous people side, we have asked for this for at least a decade. But I also believe it will be helpful if the mining sector also ask the states to implement this tool for them to be used. Both the judicial decision might be a way to implement the free, prior, and informed consent, but we also need the political will. So and together we can actually give the momentum in the implementation of the free, prior, and informed consent by states, and also to share good practices. Unfortunately, I'm from my region, have not any best practices to share with you. So, but I will have to leave in a minute or two, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for my fellow presenters. It has been really interesting to hear.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you for your time today. I'm not sure, does Edson and Darren, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Edson, do you want to go first? Thank you. So this issue of consent, it may surprise people, but when Captain Cook, Lieutenant Cook, left England in 1768 on his voyage to the Southern Pacific, he was issued a set of orders by the Admiralty, and one set of those orders makes it explicit: with the consent of the natives to acquire suitable lands for the King of England. So since 1768, the Australian colonial experience has had this requirement for consent. So my faith in the state being able to enact and uphold consent is a little bit brittle. However, when we look at consent from the perspective of risk, and when we look at Indigenous rights holders and the extent of their engagement and participation and consent, their freely offered consent for such projects from the perspective of risk, then we go to a very different approach. We go, well, projects that do not have that consent are actually higher risk projects, and projects that have Indigenous consent and participation are actually better projects for those inputs. So from a risk perspective, you weigh that up simply from a risk perspective, and in the past there may have been an appetite for more risk, and people that were supporting proponents may have been willing to accommodate higher risk, but now we don't need to. And so now when you're looking to invest or when you're looking to participate in a project, we're all very conscious of risk. And so projects that can reduce risk, lift certainty, and then demonstrate consent from Indigenous rights holders are better projects.
Thank you, Darren. And Edson, if you'd like to just make a quick comment. I know we're running out of time now, but I'll give you the opportunity to provide your perspective as well.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Darren. Quickly, two points. One, we have in Brazil our partners holding suspended. They were able by suspend by justice for now 5 projects. One in our region, Vale de Jequitinhonha, and 4 in the other close to the Amazon forest, because of a not appropriate FPIC process. These projects are suspended in companies' projects for almost 5 years altogether. 5 years, the company is not, the investments are having problems, the banks, the government, the insurance company, everyone is losing because of a bad FPIC processes. And all these communities, I know them because we have been working together, they were not against the project. They were against the way the project were being conducted. And this leads me to the second point, that the element of pre-informed consent. Unfortunately, the mining industry, especially, I'm not saying this myself, but we have many studies in Nature, in scientific business publications showing that the mining company, mining industry does a very bad work in terms of informing the society, the communities, the real impact of their activities. They are very good in reforming and reporting to investment company, to the stock market, to the government, to the technical business staff. But informing the communities, they are failing that. The best way to conduct a very good ethic process is to take seriously every single step. Prior, to invite communities to be part of the process before when they are planning to do this. Inform it, invest with them, share with the community capacity building projects. Just not send them piles and piles of paper for them to read. They will not read, but conduct with them, invite third parties, governments, to work together with communities to inform well the communities about how to be informed about the project. What are the real? I think Darren said that, or our other colleague. The real the time of this impact. How long going to be the impact of these minings? How much revenue do we will produce for the company, for the government, the tax, everything that is going to happen during and after the enterprise. If the community is well informed, we know this from the ground. They are so ready to talk further towards a positive outcome for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Edson. And thank you to all the panelists today for such an interesting discussion and your valuable insights and your time as well. Just to conclude very quickly, I'll pass to Andreas Snabria, who is the coordinator of the OECD Mining Regions and Cities Initiative. So Andreas, if you want to wrap up the session.
Yes, very quickly, and just thanking all for the participation. Just to mention that this is a great input for us for the discussion that we are going to have in Canada in October. We are here, Darren, Edson, we have Eric from the summits, but we are missing the Colombians, the Chileans, people from Alaska. So in that meeting in Canada, we are going to get their views, and the idea is to come up with some concrete actions, some proposals. You have mentioned some. I think that is very important. This consent, the putting into the loop the risk of the markets and the risk of the projects to the markets. I think that is a very good output too. So at the end of the day, the idea is to to make these actions and probably circulate it with you again, so you can also give your inputs by written, and we can have something more strong at the end of this conference and at the end of the year. For the city, I think it's important, and it's our role to support this type of activities and connect you with other indigenous people that have some ideas and some needs also. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye.